Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight in what is our final lecture in this season's series. We're very excited to look at this topic, and it's an extremely exciting and interesting topic. The Kirtland's Warbler, I was blown away the last time I heard about it, and it's a really unique connection to Michigan, so you're going to enjoy this. Before we begin, I wanted to mention two other things that are happening at the Institute next week. On Monday, we are doing special open hours during the day from 10 to 3 for the transit of Mercury. Mercury will pass in front of the sun for the first time in 10 years, so you'll be able to watch it live through the telescope if you want to come down for that. We're very excited. And then on Tuesday, we're welcoming Dr. Eileen Johnson from Texas Tech University. She has just completed landmark research in the mammoths of the Great Lakes region. And so she will be presenting Stories from the Bones at 7 p.m. on Tuesday. That's a free lecture here in this hall. So thanks for joining. Tonight's speaker, we're pleased to welcome back Dave Ewert. Dave's, yes, exactly. Dave's current area of focus is evaluating the winter habitat of the Kirtland's Warbler in the Bahamas with partners from the International Program of U.S. Forest Service, the Institute of Tropical Forestry, and the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bahamas National Trust. I assume you're there in the winter, Dave?
Of course.
Good for you. Dave is also working on stopover sites for migratory birds and islands in the Great Lakes and surrounding region. Before joining the Great Lakes Regional Office in 2001, Dave was Director of Science and Stewardship for the Michigan chapter of the Conservancy from 1985. From 83 to 85, he was Director of Land Stewardship for the Iowa chapter. He has served as a fire manager for the Iowa and Michigan chapters of the Conservancy and worked on a wide range of conservation topics, including invasive species and forest management. Invasive species, a near and dear subject here to us with the garlic mustard that we have, and forest management. Prior to his work with the Conservancy, he was an assistant professor at Central Michigan University. Dave received his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and his master's and doctorates from the City University of New York. He has taught courses in ornithology, ecology, conservation, and biology, and conducted research on birds in Michigan, New York, the Virgin Islands, Bahamas, and Venezuela. He has published a number of technical papers as well as articles on birds for natural history magazines. Having traveled widely throughout the West Indies, Central and South America to work on research and conservation projects, he has served as a director, trustee, or advisory board member for several natural resources related organizations in Michigan and nationwide. Again, Dave, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome. And it's great to be here at Cranbrook in particular, in regard to Kirtland's Warbler, because Cranbrook Press has published two books on Kirtland's Warblers that really the seminal versions that summarize the distribution, ecology, and natural history and conservation of the Kirtland's Warblers. So we really owe a debt of gratitude to Cranbrook for maintaining that tradition. So, without further ado, I will jump into the presentation here. And what we'll cover today is I'll give you a really brief overview of TNC. Then I'll describe what makes the Kirtland's Warbler such a special and unique bird species. And then we'll talk about the ecology and conservation of Kirtland's Warbler throughout its life cycle, that is during the breeding season, winter, and during migration. And then highlight a lot of the successes that have taken place in the conservation of the Kirtland's Warblers and some of the work that still needs to be done. So first of all, just a few brief words about the Nature Conservancy so you have context for this work. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And our vision is to have a world where the diversity of life thrives. People act to conserve nature for its own sake and ability to fulfill needs and enrich our lives. Nature Conservancy, when I started 33 years ago, was a very small organization. And since its inception, 64 years ago, we've grown to 1 million members, 600 scientists, 120 million acres conserved, and we now work in 69 countries. When I started in 1983, we worked in one country. We work globally from Australia and Alaska to Zambia, and just about all continents, and looking specifically at how we can address threats to conservation with a particular emphasis on climate change, freshwater, oceans, and conservation lands, which we've always done historically. We're well known for being non-confrontational, being solution-oriented, pragmatic. In Michigan, we work statewide. We work along the coastal waters of the Great Lakes, of course. We're working to protect the waters of the Great Lakes in particular, which is a growing emphasis. Looking at having forests that are resilient to climate change and also that are adaptable to forest management, and working a lot on science and policy issues that are overarching and cover a wide range of topics. And the total amount of land that we protected is 369,219 acres. I don't think it's up to 369,220 yet. Now, with that, I'll jump in a little bit into the Kirtland's warbler and a little bit of the history of the bird. The Kirtland's warbler is one of the last North American songbirds to be discovered, and it wasn't until 1851 that a Kirtland's warbler was first collected and subsequently described. It was found in Rockport in the Lake Erie shoreline of Ohio, and during migration, which is very unusual. Most birds are discovered on their breeding grounds when they're singing and conspicuous. And it wasn't until 1879 that a Kirtland's warbler was found in Andros in the Bahamas, the wintering range of the Kirtland's warbler. Although there was a record that was hiding out in the Harvard Museum where a bird was collected on a ship between Abaco and Cuba in 1841, but no one recognized it as a new species at that time. And it wasn't until 1903 that they were first found breeding, which was near Grayling in the northern Lower Peninsula. So that's very, very unusual that a breeding bird, a breeding North American bird, was found that late. It also has a distinction, I guess, of being listed as endangered in 1967, one of the first species to be listed as endangered. So just a bit of an overview of the biology of the Kirtland's warbler. It has one of the most limited range of any North American songbird. It breeds almost entirely in Michigan and almost entirely in the northern Lower Peninsula, where about 95% of the breeding birds occur, and smaller numbers in the Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, and there are all of 2 birds right there on the Ontario-Quebec boundary. It winters here in the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos right down here, but they're all on the larger Bahamas bank. That's their total winter range. 1 or 2 have been found in Cuba. 1 turned up over here in Bermuda one Christmas. I don't know why it wanted to spend Christmas there. It was lucky to find Bermuda. And 1 or 2 have been found down here around Veracruz. But for all intents and purposes, it's a Michigan-Bahamas bird. And then it migrates roughly in a straight line. In the spring, they tend to go up like this, and in the fall, they tend to come down like this. And I'll show you some figures that describe that migration route. It is federally endangered, as I mentioned, and when the bird was listed as endangered, as for any other endangered bird, recovery goals are set. And a goal of 1,000 breeding pairs was set, at which point it would be eligible for delisting if it met that number for 5 consecutive years. That goal has been met in spades, and it's now being considered for delisting, and we'll describe some of the consequences of that and some of the ways in which that is being addressed. So this figure describes the really dramatic recovery of the Kirtland's warbler. So this is 51, this is 61, 1971, and then these are censuses that have been done every year through 2013. In 1951, they were first censused, and there were a little bit less than 500 singing males. Very small number for a bird, but it didn't alarm people too much. In 1961, it was up at 500, and again, there wasn't undue concern. In 1971, it dropped to about 200 breeding pairs, and there was a lot of concern. So it was about that point in 1971 when a lot of management activities were started, including removal of cowbirds that I'll describe and more forest management. But even with those intensive efforts, the numbers remained very low all the way until almost 1990 right here. And they came very close to extinction, actually, dropping to as low as 167 singing males at that time. But then there was a wildfire that took place right in this period right here. It was intended to be a prescribed burn in which about 450 acres was scheduled to be burned. But the winds shifted and the fire escaped, and it burned 25,000 acres. So it was a disaster in terms of the local communities. 300 structures were killed, a firefighter was killed. Subsequent to that fire, the birds, though, responded positively. It appears that that fire was sort of the stimulus combined with better management and cowbird control to start this recovery that we see today, so that by 2013, we're now over 2,000 singing males, well above the recovery goal of 1,000 right here. And last year, there was over 2,300 singing males. So it's truly a success story. And the numbers are up. Everyone's optimistic about it, and now we're trying to figure out what to do when it's delisted. A little bit about the biology of the bird. The Kirtland's warbler is one of the few warblers that breeds on the ground. They put a cup that they just sink right into the real sandy substrate. It's lined with fine grasses. The female lays 4 to 5 eggs. The young will be in the nest for about 9 or 10 days, at which point they fledge. And at that point, they have a very distinctive plumage. It looks just like a jack pine cone. They're very inconspicuous. And they just fool the predators, apparently. And after about 30 days, being fed by the parents, they're on their own. So here's a female right here, and here are a couple of the young in the nest. Kirtland's warblers, not only do they have a very small range, both in the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds, but they're very, very fussy about the habitat that they select. They really go for jack pine about 5 to 15 feet tall in stands that are at least 40 acres and preferably up to hundreds or thousands of acres of contiguous habitat of jack pine 5 to 15 feet tall. This is Mike DeCapita, a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist, in one of those stands. So very picky, even within their very small range. Those forests historically were maintained by fire. The jack pines are very volatile. And the jack pine forests are considered to be among the most flammable forests in all of the northeastern United States. So particularly in spring, when the grasses were still dry and thunderstorms first came onto the season, lightning would strike these trees and the fires would take off. And they probably always were quite large. They were natural, they were part of the landscape, and all the organisms were adapted to that kind of a system. And what those fires did is that the jack pine cones, these bracts are normally fused and very tight. As the fire goes through, the heat opens up the bracts. The seeds which are embedded inside these bracts are released and go out into the now bare mineralized soil. And then these young jack pines you see here and here appear. With the right conditions, especially when there's a lot of precipitation in spring and fall, in spring and summer, these jack pines begin to grow and the forest is regenerated. So it's a perpetuating cycle. However, with settlement, fires are now required to be suppressed. So the Kirtland's warblers cannot survive on the basis of natural process any longer. So state and federal officials have defined Kirtland's warbler management areas, about a total of 220,000 acres. They're outlined with these red lines. So each one of these is an area that's managed specifically for the Kirtland's warbler, here, all the way up toward north of Atlanta, northeast of Gaylord. These lighter green forests are part of the Huron-Manistee National Forest, and the blue-green or darker green are all state forest lands. The agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and Fish and Wildlife Service work remarkably well to ensure there's always sufficient habitat for the Kirtland's warbler. Now, what has to be done today is you try to simulate the process as close as you can. Of course, it's never perfect, but what the basic idea is to create large openings and then to put the jack pine in, much like the conditions that were created by fire historically. So what's done is there are large clear cuts that take place. So the trees are harvested. They're typically used as pulp or biofuel. There's very little value to jack pine. Following the clear cut, they have these trenchers that go in, and following this, they'll have trucks that go by, and the jack pine are just hand planted in each of these furrows. With time, the trees grow up, and it's a rather quick recovery time for the understory vegetation, and you start to get this high density of jack pine that the Kirtland's warblers prefer. And then you get these really large landscapes. This is one whole area that's been planted, and it is these large areas of young jack pine that the Kirtland's warblers really prefer. So you can go back into these areas, and the Kirtland's warbler may be the most common bird in that particular spot. Now, looking at it at a larger scale, here you've got mature jack pine back in here, and then these are just some of the old sandy two tracks that you see in much of the northern lower peninsula. And you can see the way they plant the trees in these curving lines. And the reason they do that is that the Kirtland's warblers like to nest at the edge of openings. And so by having these curving lines, you create a larger edge area and more favorable nesting habitat for the Kirtland's warblers. So this is done at a very large scale all the way through this landscape. So there can be areas up to 2,000–3,000 acres that look more or less like that of very close ages. Now, the other management activity that needs to take place to maintain the Kirtland's warbler is removing another bird species, the brown-headed cowbird. This is the male here. Brown-headed cowbirds are native to the Great Plains, where they used to follow the bison. The bison, as they went through the grasslands, would scare up the insects, and then the cowbirds would go down and feed on the insects. Bison were nomadic, so cowbirds were also nomadic. So over time, they evolved to lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species and just take right off. They don't care for their young at all. So these brown-headed cowbirds that were native to the Great Plains did not used to exist in areas with nesting Kirtland's warblers. When southern Michigan was cleared for agriculture, however, it more or less simulated an open landscape like the Great Plains. The cowbirds colonized those areas and moved up to the areas with Kirtland's warblers. When they found the Kirtland's warblers, they parasitized Kirtland's warblers. The cowbird egg is larger, the egg hatches sooner, and the young grow faster than Kirtland's warblers. The consequence is that the Kirtland's warblers feed the big mouth of the cowbird, ignore their young. The Kirtland's warbler young die, the cowbird young survives. So the productivity went way down, almost to the point where if they had not instituted cowbird control, it's likely the Kirtland's warbler would have become extinct. So now they have to continue to remove these cowbirds, and what they do is they put these enclosures up here. They'll bring cowbirds up and they'll put them in the bottom in these enclosures with seed and water. These birds will be singing and displaying. They attract cowbirds outside the enclosure. There's an opening at the top of the cage with a baffle. They drop into the cage and therefore are removed from the landscape. And then every day or two they come in and remove those cowbirds and remove them entirely. So now the parasitism rate is almost zero as a result of this approach. So it's been highly effective. And the same technique has been used for other endangered bird species as well. Now, we also want to make sure that we keep a landscape approach so that other bird species, other plant species benefit from Kirtland's warbler management. So here are some examples. Admittedly, these are not particularly colorful birds. They're all brown of one sort or another, but This is a clay-colored sparrow. It's a bird more typical of the Great Plains that also probably has moved east, and now it's in the jack pine area. The Lincoln sparrow, which is a boreal species that just breeds as far south as the jack pine plains and no further south. This is an upland sandpiper, which comes in right after they put in the furrows. It's basically a prairie species, and once the trees grow up even to about 3 or 4 feet, they're gone. And then this is a spruce grouse. This is another boreal species, which, like the Lincoln sparrow here, is at the southern limit of its range in the Kirtland warbler colony. So you get a nice array of other species that a lot of birders seek in this region. Now, there are other beneficiaries of Kirtland warbler management as well, and as we go into conservation increasingly and recognize that this needs to be integrated with local communities, that tourism and ecotourism is a very rapidly growing industry. So what's happening in the local communities is that there are tours that go out to these Kirtland warbler colonies, and people literally come from all around the world and all around the United States to join these tours. And then there'll be guides, like Scott Johnson here from the Bahamas, that will explain what's being done to manage these birds. They almost always have a bird that's particularly photogenic and always has a nice conspicuous perch, and they go there. Maybe it's this perch over here. And then people get to see the Kirtland warblers. And that way people aren't wandering around into the colonies and causing disturbance, keeping in mind they're nesting on the ground, so they're very sensitive. So this is very valuable to local communities because it brings tourists in during May when hotels are not typically full and restaurants don't have a lot of business. So it's this so-called shoulder season, and it's an excellent supplement to tourism in the rest of the year. And now there's a Kirtland Warbler Festival, and this too brings in people, and it's in Roscommon the first week in June, for example, there will be this festival. So people really, that also has a little bit of impetus to the local economy. Now we're going to switch to the south now and look at the wintering grounds, and a lot of the work I describe here is work that myself and colleagues have been working on since 2002. And this is Joe Wonderly of the Forest Service and Eric Carey of the Bahamas National Trust, and a whole variety of colleagues from 5 different countries have participated in the project. So when we started this project, our work was right over here on the island of Andros. The literature suggested that Kirtland warblers wintered in the northern Bahamas in Caribbean pine forests. And those Caribbean pine forests are in Andros, Grand Bahama, Abaco, and New Providence right here where Nassau is located. So we started right here. We were there for about 3 months. We saw 2 birds. Not very encouraging. So then some of our colleagues from the Bahamas National Trust were on the island of Eleuthera, and they found 6 Kirtland warblers at one site on one day. That was the highest number of Kirtland warblers that we know of that have been spotted on one day in the history of the bird. So Joe and I talked for about 30 seconds, and our project went from Andros to Eleuthera the next year. And subsequently, I'll describe some of the work from Eleuthera, some of the ecology work, and some of the conservation work we're designing. But we've done a lot of surveys from Grand Bahama and Abaco all the way down here to the Turks and Caicos now to try to determine where Kirtland warblers are most abundant. Prior to our work, it wasn't really known what the relative abundance of Kirtland warbler was in the Bahamas. It was just Bahamas. So as a result of our surveys, we went up to Grand Bahama. I think we found 2 birds in 10 days. We were on Abaco, another pine island, 3 weeks, 3 birds in 1 day. That was it. I mentioned we only found 2 or 3 on Andros. But here on Eleuthera, we found over 250. On Cat Island, right here, last year, we found about 45 in a week. On San Salvador, where Christopher Columbus first discovered America, it's reputed to be, we've been consistently finding 20 or so in about a week. Long Island, we've 10 in a week. Down here on Crooked Knocklands, 3 in 2 weeks. Down here in the Turks and Caicos, where we were this spring, we found 1 in 10 days. So what this is clearly indicating is that the Bahamas, the central Bahamas, this group of islands right here, is probably where most of the Kirtland warblers overwinter. That's a huge step in our knowledge, because now when we start to focus on conservation, it will be here and not up here, as the current literature suggested, as the initial literature suggested. Now, what kind of habitat do they use? Whenever I describe going to the Bahamas, especially to my colleagues in my office in Lansing, they always think I'm going to the beach, and having margaritas, sunglasses, use lots of suntan lotion. But we're really here in the scrub, away from the water. So this is the kind of range of habitats that Kirtland warblers use. This is short scrub that has a lot of a shrub called wild sage. The birds feed on the fruit. Here's another example of habitat where there's a lot of exposed rock in this area, and then a lot of shrubs coming in. And this pole here is about 10 feet or 3 meters. And they also use slightly taller habitat. So here again is our 10-foot pole with taller vegetation and taller yet. So this roughly describes the range of scrub that the Kirtland warblers use. So it's short, dense, thorny, difficult scrub to get through. Now we've also been looking at other aspects of that coppice to see if there's something about certain aspects of the coppice that the birds are zeroing in on. So in this figure at the top, this black bar represents the proportion of plots where we captured Kirtland warblers that have this plant, Chiacoca alba or snowberry, which is right here. And this figure right here represents other plots that we sampled randomly with the same, looking also at the proportion of snowberry, and it's less. So the birds appear to be selecting areas with snowberry. Similarly, with this Erythalis fruticosa or black torch, we found more Kirtland warblers on plots with a higher percent of the black torch than random plots. Same thing with wild sage right here. So it appears that they are selectively going to those parts of the coppice that have snowberry, that have black torch, and wild sage. So they're even pretty fussy about their habitat in the winter. So this is just another iteration of this. But they also eat insects, spiders, ants. So here's a Bahamian spider and Bahamian ant. Areas that are rich in fruit also tend to be rich in arthropods. And we've also found just very recently that in late winter in particular, when they're fattening up to migrate north for the spring migration, they particularly seem to zero in on spiders and other predaceous insects. We don't know why. And Kirtland warblers are one of the few birds that really eat a lot of ants. You'll see them a lot of time on the ground picking up ants. So how does the habitat get created for Kirtland warblers? Naturally, it's storms along the coast. This is an area on Eleuthera prior to Hurricane Sandy. This is after Hurricane Sandy, the salt spray having top killed the vegetation. And black torch, which is one of the fruit species favored by the Kirtland warbler, is scattered all through here. It will resprout, and the Kirtland warblers can use that coastal habitat. It can be extreme, however. This 2 years ago on San Salvador, we were a nice stretch of beach, and we found one Kirtland warbler. There were really 15 really nice beach houses along there that weren't causing any real damage. We went there just 3 or 4 weeks ago. None of those homes were standing. Part of the vegetation was totally dead because of a storm surge from Hurricane Joaquin. That was a Category 4 hurricane. So it can also cause damage, but we think that in the long term that hurricanes probably maintain the short coppice, and often hurricanes are associated with a lot of rainfall. With that rainfall comes a flush of new vegetation, and a flush of new vegetation results in a lot of fresh young leaves for insects to feed on, which is all good for the Kirtland warbler. So there are a number of ways that winter habitat is created. We just talked about the hurricanes. Fire is another one. Some of it is natural, especially after a hurricane. You have a dry period, it's dry, and a fire can go sweeping through. But a lot more of it is human-set or anthropogenic. Bahamians love to bulldoze, and so you get these vast areas. And if the bulldozing is not complete, you get lots of sprouts of these plants come in, including that of wild sage and black torch. It'll come back and create good warbler habitat, and slash and burn agriculture over here as well. Given enough time, and provided that there's a seed base of some of these favored fruit species, it will turn into good habitat like this. And you may have good habitat from a complete disturbance like this for maybe another 35 years, that the birds will use that habitat since that disturbance. Now, another interesting twist on all of this is that if we're going to apply conservation in the Bahamas, we need to think of a large-scale approach. You just can't do it 1 acre at a time. So we're trying to think along those lines. There's even less money in the Bahamas for conservation than here. So one of the observations we've made is that where there are goat farms or where goats have browsed previously, we find the highest densities of Kirtland warblers. Goats and islands and conservation are usually an absolute anathema. So we're trying to figure out what to do with that. Another observation we've made is along the rights-of-ways, the vegetation is cut back, obviously, to keep the trees from growing up into the lines, and that is good habitat for wild sage, black torch, and the fruiting species, and we often find Kirtland warblers under these power lines or at the edge, feeding on the fruits in the lines. So we've been talking with the Bahamas Electricity Corporation to try to maintain those lines. That's recently privatized, so we'll need to reinitiate those discussions. But that is an example of a large-scale approach that might work. So the rights-of-way management is something we're focusing on because of the periodic clearing, because we know it supports Kirtland warblers. We don't quite know how often it needs to be treated, or the frequency, which is something we'll work with them on. And the goats, we're not sure what to do yet. We've got a great friend, Mr. Simonet, who's a very sophisticated goat farmer. He's let us work on his farm for many years. And we've tried to figure out from his experience whether we can make this work at a large enough scale. So far, we haven't found the silver bullet. It's very capital intensive. There are wild dogs that kill the goats, so it requires a lot of fencing. And most Bahamian youth don't want to raise goats. They want to go to NASA. So we're not quite sure what to do yet. Haven't quite given up yet, but I'm not sure it has the promise that we once thought it did, even though we know the highest density of Kirtland warblers appear to be associated with goat browsing. Now, another one we kind of talked about recently is sustainable farming. There's an organization I'll touch on that's just beginning to work on sustainable farming on Eleuthera, where there are lots of birds. And we may be able to develop ways that sustainable farming can be done, and perhaps at a large enough scale, to produce fruiting shrubs for the birds. We're just getting those discussions started. Another is ecotourism. When you manage for Kirtland warblers, you also benefit a lot of other bird species that birders from US would have to go to the Bahamas to see. This hummingbird right here, the Bahama wood star, is found in the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, nowhere else in the world. This Bahama yellowthroat right here is also found in the Bahamas, nowhere else in the world. So for people who are tickers or life listers, you got to go there. And then you've got this really amazing bird right here, the great lizard cuckoo, that just kind of flaps around and a little bit like a roadrunner in some respects. That's found only in the Bahamas and Cuba. And this greater Antillean bullfinch, a little more widespread, but a bird that is not in the U.S. So in developing ecotourism, you would associate the Kirtland warbler with these and perhaps attract a wide array of potential ecotourists. We do know of some people, however, that have come to the Bahamas specifically to see Kirtland warblers in the winter. So we're talking with this one organization, One Eleuthera Foundation, obviously on Eleuthera, and what they have done is to buy an old resort that used to be owned by Pan Am back in their heydays in the 70s. They're renovating the buildings so that they'll have rental units and lodging. They're training local Bahamians, local Eleutherians on ecotourism and a whole variety of trades to try to hold people on Eleuthera. So we met with them about 6 weeks or so ago, presented a plan on things they should consider in ecotourism. They're already beginning to use that, so we were grateful to see that. And we continue to work with them, the National Audubon Society and the Bahamas National Trust, to train ecotourism guides that they can use these facilities to try to generate revenue for Eleuthera. So this is kind of a really exciting part of the project we're just getting started on, and hopefully we can create sustainable economics that will result in sustainable populations of Kirtland's warblers. Now, another part of the picture is migration. Most of the mortality of Kirtland's warblers is during migration. It's probably always been the case, but it's probably been exacerbated by changes in the landscape as well. These red lines here represent an individual path of 6 different Kirtland's warblers from the wintering grounds migrating north to Michigan. And a colleague of ours, Nathan Cooper at the Smithsonian Institution, has been putting a device, a geolocator, on these birds that's light sensitive, and they can, these devices record based on the light, the duration of the day and the intensity of light at noon. They can determine latitude and longitude every day and thereby trace the migration route. They have to capture the bird and download the data here in Michigan, and then they have continued these studies, and they now have data for about 25 birds. So this is very exciting because for the first time, we really know what the migration route is. And even more exciting is that they've been able to determine how long they stay at certain places, and therefore which stopover sites might be most important to protect. So here, it turns out a lot of the birds, once they fly from the Bahamas, they'll stop along the Florida coast. Heavily developed, but go too far inland and there's quite a bit of habitat. Interestingly enough, they found a lot of the birds stop right here in southern Georgia and northern Florida. And then they hightail it up to the western Lake Erie Basin and then to the breeding grounds. In the fall, they concentrate in the North Carolina and South Carolina coast and apparently then fly over water to the Bahamas. So this is very exciting. And we're just starting to think how we can begin to use that information. And by the way, it only takes as little as 8 days for a Kirtland's warbler to migrate from Michigan, from the Bahamas to Michigan.
8 days?
8 days, 1,500 miles, a 1-ounce bird. Now, they're not flying every day. They fly when the wind conditions are right, but it's a remarkably short, far shorter than people thought birds migrated even 10 years ago. Now these birds, when they're migrating, no surprise, they select shrubby habitat, just like the wintering grounds. And one of the areas is along the boardwalk here at McGee Marsh, which is almost every year a Kirtland's warbler shows up there. So, now that we've got a little bit better idea where the birds are stopping and spending time, east Florida coast, southern Georgia, northern Florida, western Lake Erie Basin, and coastal Carolinas here. Then you can begin to look at land coverage and try to figure out where might the birds be under the most stress. Obviously, the Florida coast itself is heavily developed, but there's a lot of forest right in back. In southern Georgia, northern Florida, there's a lot of forest cover there, shown by the colors here. If you go to the western Lake Erie Basin, it's another story. You got Detroit, you got Toledo, a lot of agricultural land, very little habitat. Plus, if birds get caught out over Lake Erie, they can come down in a storm and drown. And on the way down, it's good here. So we think, at least based on what we know now, which is very still preliminary, but it's beginning to suggest that in terms of stopover work, this is where you want to work, right there, western Lake Erie Basin. And you look at the western Lake Erie Basin, this is Lake Erie, this is the Toussaint River, mostly agriculture with just small isolated forest patches, and a multitude of birds have to share those forest patches during migration. Generally, when you get higher densities of birds, you get lower mass gains, so the birds are under a little bit more stress. Fortunately, protection is beginning to take place. The Nature Conservancy is working in Great Ewert Marsh and reestablishing some forest in Ohio near a state park to allow for stopover sites. Michigan Nature Conservancy is working in Erie Marsh along the dikes. There's a lot of good forest cover in addition to the wetland value of that project. And then the Saginaw Bay shoreline, this is Tawas Point. Almost always the Kirtland's warbler shows up there during spring migration as well. So the more we can protect wooded habitat along these shorelines, the better. And like Bahamas and like the breeding grounds, if you begin to protect migration, there are all kinds of other beneficiaries. Kim Kaufman here and Mark Shieldcastle, both of the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, they put on the biggest week in American birding that some of you may be familiar with. In a short period of approximately 5 or so years, it's become the biggest birding festival in the country. It has a huge impact on the local economy. A study done by Bowling Green State University a couple of years ago indicated that the additional income to those local communities from this birding festival and during the month of May is roughly $35 million. So we're hoping that this kind of impact then will have, again, a positive feedback loop so that people will become more interested in conservation, create more and better habitat, and have better stopover habitat for the Kirtland's warblers and many other species of birds as well. There's a lot to do. So I'll focus on these activities here. Building conservation capacity, especially in the Bahamas. Making sure that we coordinate internationally. And I won't say a lot about climate change except that two things. One is Jack Pine Forest is a boreal forest at the southern limit of its range where Kirtland's warblers breed. So it's projected to retreat northward. So there are already inventories taking place in Ontario and the Upper Peninsula to try to determine where Kirtland's warbler habitat can be maintained or expanded in the event of climate change. In the Bahamas, it's even worse. The highest point in the Bahamas is all of 200 feet above sea level. 80% of the country is 6 feet or less above sea level. And I just, about a month or so ago, I was at a meeting in which Bahamians were talking about climate change. There are even discussions of what to do with Bahamians themselves should the islands become flooded out. Where would they be moved to? So this obviously has implications for the Kirtland's warbler as well, if you lose all that land mass. Perhaps the birds are more resilient than us. Birds have had to move around a lot in glacial periods, and maybe they go down to Dominican Republic or whatever, but we know it's something we have to pay close attention to. And another really important activity that I'll briefly describe is this Kirtland's Warbler Alliance. If the Kirtland's warbler becomes delisted, there's loss of funding, and so it has to be raised additionally. So there's talk of raising an endowment fund, and I'll describe a little bit how people are thinking about that. So training, and Gene Graham here in the audience is very familiar with this work and been very supportive of a lot of this work, and we really thank Gene for that. What we did is, when we set up this program back in 2002, we actually met with Bahamians in the late 90s. We asked Bahamians what they would want out of this project. One of the things they wanted was trained conservationists. So when we set this program up, that was an explicit part of it. And this training program consists of training College of the Bahamas students in the Bahamas and Michigan. We established paid internships and contracts for 8 students. And what they did was spend 2 seasons in the Bahamas, roughly from late October until late April. And then they would come up to Michigan and see the birds here and learn a variety of other conservation approaches. So it's very intensive, depended on a lot of people to do this. Phil Huber, the U.S. Forest Service, was really great in the Michigan side of things. We also made a commitment to support their undergraduate education support and provided each student $15,000 a year for 2 years, assuming they earned a 3.0 at least. And so these were contracts, basically, for them to proceed through school. Some of the students have gone on to their own to postgraduate work. And we've also helped support these students postgraduate through mentoring and helping create jobs, working with Bahamian colleagues. So I'll describe a few of the details on how this has worked. The students attended these universities: Cornell, Northern Michigan, St. Mary's, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, University of Minnesota. 8 students all graduated, and 4 have gone on to graduate school on their own. And here's a shot of some of the team. This is Eric Carey right here, the executive director of the Bahamas National Trust, a good friend and colleague. This is Joe Wonderly. He's been a colleague I've known for over 40 years, so we've worked very well over the years. Dave Curry, our first project manager from the UK that we selected because he'd worked in the Seychelles in some difficult situations, and the students all along in here. This is Keith, Lino, Ingeria, Scott, Everton, and a couple more that couldn't attend this reunion. So they've all done very well. In fact, I'm going to see Lino tomorrow. He's working on his PhD at Miami University and is mentoring inner-city Detroit students. So here are some examples of what they've done. Starting here with Zico. He's now teaching at College of the Bahamas. Undergraduates, he's doing some really interesting work on Caribbean pine forests relative to hurricanes, and has helped us with some of our additional Kirtland Warbler surveys. Lino right here is working on his PhD at Miami University. Between undergraduate and school and graduate school, he worked with the Nature Conservancy on coral reefs. They've got to take on a variety of positions when they're in the Bahamas. And he's also working regionally. He's on the board of Birds Caribbean, so he's working with colleagues throughout the Caribbean Basin. And Jerry Miller, who went to Cornell, did an amazing job working with a senior government official in the Bahamas and developed the forest policy for the whole country of the Bahamas, including fire management, including harvest, including set-aside areas, and all that was part of her work. Now she's working on her master's degree in environmental law and policy at Columbia. And Scott Johnson, who has just joined us in Turks and Caicos 3 weeks ago, does an outstanding job with outreach and is expanding his scientific expertise, and we continue to work with Scott as well. We also need to coordinate internationally. None of this work can be done unless you have really good collaboration between U.S. and Bahamas in particular, but Canada and other countries that have expertise. This is a blurry shot because we didn't know quite what we were doing in the late 90s. So we're really focusing in on climate change and other aspects of this work, obtaining funding to support efforts in the Bahamas, and in turn the Bahamas really facilitate us working in the Bahamas and making resources available. So it's an ongoing relationship that's been very strong for 15 years. And why is all this important? Why is it so critical that we interface at all aspects of the life cycle, that is, wintering, breeding, and wintering? One is this: March drought. Droughts are projected to increase with climate change. that has consequences for the Kirtland warblers in that they may be in poor body condition because there aren't enough resources for them to put on fat to migrate. This has the consequence of delaying their departure, and it may slow migration because they don't have the resources to migrate at a fast clip. The consequence is that they arrive on the breeding grounds late. The consequence of that is that there's reduced reproductive success, there's higher mortality, or the juvenile males are more sensitive to drought, and they have even more delayed arrival than the older males, and there's lower survival rate. So what happens in the Bahamas affects the breeding grounds. And no doubt the reverse happens. We just don't have the data to do that, and no doubt there are interactions taking place in migration that we don't know yet. So the next thing is trying to figure out how we keep the Kirtland's Warbler program, which has been one of the most successful recovery programs of any threatened and endangered species in the country, alive and well, should it become delisted. So the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance has been formed. And this is a stakeholder group that has several goals. One is to increase visibility of Kirtland's Warbler conservation, so there's interest, so resources come in to support it. Another is to establish a long-term fund or an endowment fund to complement existing funding after delisting. This process is just barely getting started, but it will be critical because once the Kirtland's Warbler is delisted, there will be no more threatened and endangered money to control cowbirds, for example, and it has to come from somewhere. And also this group will facilitate coordination between public and private interests so that the Kirtland's Warbler conservation is continued, but also it's supporting ecosystem, the jack pine ecosystem. So a number of people will be serving on that board to get this going. So it's been a really great success story in that over the years, the last 30 years, there's been an amazing group of people who have worked extremely well together to always focus on results and improving habitat for the Kirtland's Warbler. There's been a lot of adaptation to the times, from a single focus on Kirtland's Warblers to the overall jack pine landscape and integrating with socioeconomic considerations, outreach, and other components. There's a lot more to do, and one is making sure that there's attention to Kirtland's Warblers on its migration route, wintering grounds, as well as the breeding grounds. So far it's mostly been on the breeding grounds, which is logical, but now that we know more about these other parts of the breeding cycle, it'll be time to work on those as well. And then to ensure that commitment is maintained even if it's delisted. So before I finish, just give you a little end plate here. Here's just some information on the Nature Conservancy. For those of you that aren't members, some of the benefits of membership. There are lots of volunteer opportunities, so just contact any of us if you're interested in doing something like that. There's an event coming up here at Ives Road Fen on May 7th. There may be rain, but we'll find out. But we hope you can join us. It's been a great restoration project. And if you have any other questions, here's my phone number, email address. And any questions? So that terminates my presentation. Yes?
I was surprised to learn that when they put the species on the endangered species list, that they have that goal. I didn't know that. So, but I seem to recall from your chart that the goal was reached quite a bit ago.
Yes, so good.
So I'm curious, there's been no pushback. I mean, how long does it typically take for the delisting process or for somebody to want to push at that? Excellent question. So the question really is, the numbers of Kirtland's warblers have exceeded the goal dramatically and for a long time. So why hasn't it been delisted already?
people recognize that without management, cowbird control and intensive forest management, the numbers would drop back again. So unless you have a funding mechanism in place to ensure that you've got cowbird control and appropriate forest management, delisting is useless because it would become listed again.
You have a wonderful circle and have put together, and you're putting together more of collaboration. But are there other endangered species programs that overlap with you that you work with?
Good question. We've been focusing mostly on Kirtland's warbler per se, but in the jackpine ecosystem, there's something called the secretive locust. So in response to your question about what's being done with other endangered species relative to the Kirtland's warblers, management is being adapted to account for these other species where they occur within the range of the Kirtland's warbler. The Bahamas does not have an endangered species list, so we can't explicitly integrate with work in the Bahamas that way. But in the jackpine system, that's where this landscape approach is being adopted to try to account for exactly what you say. And also, there's a Massasauga rattlesnake population, for example, so be careful not to use prescribed burns that would be useful for Kirtland's warblers, but could be damaging to the Massasauga if not done properly. So those kinds of things are slowly making their way into this overarching jackpine ecosystem plan. Is that getting at your question okay? Okay. Yes?
I'm going to go out in August and look for Kirkland warblers up in the jackpines. Now, should I be listening rather than looking? What's the best way to see one?
In August, it's almost hopeless. The birds are very difficult to see except when they're singing and conspicuous. In August, they tend to be molting and very quiet. Some of the recent work suggests they're in the jackpine plains, but you would have to probably spend a lot of time searching them out and being in those stands that perhaps have the highest densities of Kirtland's warblers, and maybe you'd be lucky to glimpse one. But if you want to see a Kirtland's warbler, I recommend going on one of the tours in May or June.
Thank you.
Where are all the tours?
The tours, the Kirtland's warbler tours are based out of Hartwick Pine State Park, and then at the Mayo Ranger Station of the U.S. Forest Service.
We only have 2 areas where we have tours done.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. The Forest Service charges, I understand, Hartwick Pines does not. Yes?
How secure is the funding for the jackpine management? Seems like it takes a lot of land and a lot of moving earth and whatever to continue to plant and take care of the whole forest. How secure is the funding for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, how secure is funding to manage the jackpine forests in Michigan? So far, they've been able to do it because they can generate at least some income from pulp production, and that helps sustain the work. Also, some of the funding comes to support those programs because it benefits game species, such as snowshoe hare. It's particularly good for snowshoe hare, and some deer hunting. So there's other sources of revenue that come in to supplement that from the actual sale of the jackpine. But it's always a bit iffy, and if the markets for jackpine are poor, there's a lot of discussion of what to do.
And that's the state of Michigan that provides the funding?
State of Michigan and the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service. Yes, exactly. Yes?
Related to that, how much ongoing management of the jackpines are needed once an area is kind of restored? Does that just kind of permanently need to be actively managed?
Yes. Every year there has to be a certain amount of acreage of jackpine that's cut and cleared. The goal is to have approximately 35,000 acres of jack pine in the 5 to 15 feet tall range. So I've forgotten the exact total, but I think it's somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 acres need to be cut every year to maintain that amount of habitat in those age classes. So it's a very well coordinated and organized, and then additional habitat can be created occasionally with wildfire. So that can also supplement what's being done through the active cutting program. Yes?
How do you think delisting would affect your efforts in the Bahamas? Because it seems to me that, from what I know a little bit about the Bahamas, they don't have a lot of money to spend on conservation. If they spend any at all, they don't have those resources. I assume all your work, the work that you do comes from the Nature Conservancy funding, but if the bird's delisted, do you lose money from other agencies? Or do you even get money from other agencies? And do you anticipate maybe help from corporations or foundations?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do you maintain the funding for this work in winter in the Bahamas? The work is largely funded by the international program of the Forest Service, and they've been very supportive and have indicated that they will continue to support the work for the next couple of years. And what we're trying to do in the next couple of years is to try to institutionalize our work in the Bahamas as much as we possibly can. There will always be a scramble for funding, and in many cases it'll have to be specific for certain projects. In the Bahamas, we're trying to come up with management scenarios that take little money, like rights-of-ways, for the reasons you mentioned. Or we're also beginning to talk with other NGOs in the Bahamas, like Wendell Luther Foundation, and hope that they can pick up some of this over time as well. There's also a native, Bahamas National Trust has something called the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve that's funded by a very wealthy philanthropist in New York City. And we're hoping she'll get more interested in this kind of work and at least help certain aspects of the work as well. So I'm not sure that we'll ever have this mammoth foundation fund that will guarantee funding over time. It'll always be seeking sources of funding to help keep this along. But right now, we're okay.
You get much support from the Audubon Society?
We work with National and Michigan Audubon Society on various aspects of the project. Right now, National Audubon Society has a program where they're training ecotourism guides in the Bahamas with Bahamas National Trust. So we plan to be working with them as they develop this program and then go collectively from there. So we're doing some complementary work. Yes?
What's the life expectancy of the bird, one? And two, your GPS birds, do they go back to the same locale?
Yes, so the question is, how old are the birds? How old do they live? And how faithful are they to their winter and breeding sites? Kirtland's warblers typically live 4 to 5 years, although we did find one in the Bahamas that was 12. So he wasn't white like my hair, but his bands were faded and white. The birds tend to return, especially in the breeding grounds, to the same site year after year. And the same thing with the wintering grounds. But there are some amazing situations where birds have moved dramatically. So one bird that was banded in the northern lower peninsula 2 years ago showed up in the upper peninsula a year later. And the same thing has happened the reverse. It may happen with other birds that way, but because Kirtland's warblers are tracked far more closely than most birds, you can pick up some of these incredible dispersal events. Another situation is where a bird was banded as a nestling in Michigan and showed up 500 miles away as a breeding bird in Ontario. And in the Bahamas, the birds tend to come back to the same site, but we know they move at least up to 10 miles in some winters, especially in late winter, where conditions may become so severe at one site and food resources disappear that they prospect the landscape and end up at a food-rich site. So there's some movement, but they tend to home. Yes?
In the areas that are being bulldozed, the jack pine, and then replanted, is it exclusively jack pine that's being replanted there, or are there other tree species going in as well?
Yeah, good question. When the jack pine is cleared, the question is whether you replant only with jack pine or perhaps add other species like red pine. Currently, it's all jack pine. There's a lot of interest in experimenting with red pine because a lot of the Kirtland warblers in Wisconsin are in red pine. Red pine has much higher commercial value. So from the perspective of the state of Michigan and the Forest Service, they'd like to get more revenue. So there's some talk of experimenting a little bit, but it's unclear quite what will happen yet.
And I think the follow-up there would be, so there's no concern about getting these large stands of jack pine in terms of pest management,
Yeah,
coming in and possibly wiping out the jack pine stand.
Jack pine in that part of Michigan always grew that way. It was always very homogeneous, pure stands. So it's a natural landscape. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of the stopover areas as they migrate north, and virtually when they go back, I suspect. How do you anticipate developing a plan for creating some buzz or developing the importance of those stopover areas, especially in that area of Florida and Georgia where you talked about, probably pretty rural, I would guess, huh?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, how do we develop interest in protecting stopover sites? And there's still a very critical piece of missing information. We still, even if we know where the birds are occurring, and we know that most of the mortality is occurring during migration, we don't know yet where that mortality is occurring. So once we find out where the mortality is occurring, we can begin, and that's going to take real-time transmitters and things of that sort that are not yet available. Then we can look at those areas where mortality is occurring and see if it has something to do with the habitat, and then focus on that. In the interim, we can begin to look at those areas a little bit more critically. It's probably a little premature to highlight those areas to any degree yet, except Western Lake Erie Basin, where there's already a strong interest in protecting that stopover habitat. And we are starting to work with people to try to expand those stopover areas. Good question. Yes?
How friendly are the Kirtland warblers with people? Do they mind people coming to watch them and try to track them?
So how friendly are Kirtland warblers? They approach you. I don't know if that means they're friendly. They're not shy. I've had Kirtland warblers land on my boot. I don't know what else I can really say, except that I don't think they're that sensitive to human intrusion in the sense of approach. Where the intrusion is a problem is when they're nesting, because the nests are on the ground, and if they're feeding young, anything that reduces the rate at which they're feeding young is obviously not good for the growth rate of the young. So they're great birds. And am I answering your question at all? Okay. Yes.
When do they arrive in Michigan, and when are they experiencing that? Immediately upon arrival?
nest, and then it takes a couple of weeks to arrive.
Okay, the question is, when the birds arrive in the spring and when do they nest relative to their arrival time? Males almost always arrive before females by a few days, and then once the females arrive, they kind of shop around and look for the right male, maybe the one with the showiest plumage and the best song and that sort of thing. Once they select a mate, they get into nest building fairly quickly as long as the weather's good. If you have a cold, rainy period, it will be delayed. But within a matter of a couple of weeks, they'll be starting to build a nest and then laying their eggs. And so by Memorial Day, there are a lot of nests with eggs. The females they start arriving earliest females would arrive in maybe, let's just say 7th or 8th of May, the very first ones. And females will continue to arrive right through the end of the month. So they don't all arrive at exactly the same time, but most will arrive early. Does that get your question okay? Okay.
Can you hum a few bars?
I wish I could. My family, all of us are horrible singers. I don't think you'd want to hear me try. Yes?
I know you've dedicated a lot of your professional life to doing research on this bird. What drew your interest initially?
Yeah, so the question was, what was my original interest in Kirtland's warblers? I grew up in Michigan, and so I was always intrigued with the idea that we had a bird species that was here and nowhere else in the world. So I started getting interested in birds when I was in grade school. And I just kind of went from there. In high school, went up with the local Audubon Society and got to see them. And there have been periods where I haven't done much with Kirtland's warblers, and then it's been peaks and valleys, and lately it's been a high plateau.
So you learned about the bird in elementary school?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Science class or whatever?
Yeah. My grandfather was just interested in birds too, so that helped.
So how many broods a year are they having, the birds, do you know?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
How many young are they having a year, roughly?
Yeah, each pair typically nests once and lays 4 to 5 eggs, of which typically 3 to 4 will fledge.
So they're not being very helpful, being so selective, having so few birds.
Yeah, that's one way to express it. They're not helping themselves as much as they might, right?
They take care of these cowbirds, oh my gosh.
Right. Well, they are what's called a conservation-reliant species, where they're really dependent on us to keep them going at this point, like many endangered species. Of course, we created some of the bad conditions for them, so they can blame us if they want. Yes?
It's my understanding that they like warm weathers, and that makes me wonder how cold the temperatures may endure.
Yeah, so the comment is that Kirtland's warblers like warm weather, and how cold the temperature can they endure. When they arrive here in the spring, it can easily, especially in the jack pine country, get down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit and snow when they're here. So they can tolerate that for a while, certainly. Birds are pretty well adapted to that as long as there's a good food supply. They're well insulated with their feathers, and they find local sites that are warmer than the ambient typically. And in the Bahamas, it can get bitterly cold in the winter, get down in the 50s at night. And in Grand Bahamas, we used to kid one of the Bahamians who was from Grand Bahama. It's even gotten down into the 30s and snowed once. But maybe that's why they're not in the northern Bahamas, right? Yes?
What altitude do they typically migrate?
It's a great question. What altitude do they migrate? We don't know. But if they're like most songbirds, it's probably somewhere in the range, depending on weather conditions and the airflow at a certain altitude in any one night, somewhere more typically around 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the surface. but it may vary considerably. Okay, one last question here.
One last question. I know that the recovery team just handed over responsibility to the Alliance. How do you think that's going to work out? They got a good group together? Or?
Yeah, so the comment is that the recovery team has been disbanded and replaced by a conservation team and an alliance, the Kirtland Warbler Alliance. This was all done with a great deal of discussion, and many members of people who are on the recovery team are on the conservation team. They will be making recommendations on activities that need to be done, research that needs to be done, priorities, and presumably then the Alliance will take that information and help raise money for those priorities. I don't have any reason to think it will work anything but very well as it has in the past. It's got the same group of people and a proven track record. Thank you very much.